Okay, here we go for Writer's Read. Another wonderful afternoon session, and it is another special session with Jack Carr and
Audrey.
Audrey Weitkamp. Oh gosh, we've got to help each other in this age,
That's
don't
right.
we? Just Oh, welcome, welcome. And you know how we start every session, which is with the poem, the famous poem. I say a line, and then you say a line. Right, right, right,
Right.
until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd
You'll draw a crowd.
and bring us great delight.
And bring us great.
So, welcome to Jack and to Audrey. And I want to take a minute to share again these wonderful volumes of past Writers Read. And there's volume 1 and volume 2. They're located as you go into the library, walk toward the window, and we've been assigned the very bottom shelf. So you have to have knees that work almost, that in order to get these off the bottom shelf. I might ask for a new assignment in there now that I think about it. But it's just a treasure. Linda and I were just looking at the names of the people who have read before, and it tugs my heart, it tugs her heart to see some of these people who have shared with us who are no longer here. And so do take a minute to go look for the Writers Read 3 ringed binders on the bottom shelf in the back by the window. So let's get started here, Jack. My question to get started was, would you please share just a bit about writing and whether it fits into your daily rhythm, or is it this wonderful piece of writing? Did it come out of the blue, or are you writing every day? How does writing fit into your life?
Well, it's actually much more sporadic, and I usually have fits in which I suddenly remember things that I want to write something down about. Some of it came from wanting to preserve some of these events for our kids, for our children. Because I grew up not knowing a whole lot about my own family, about my parents, and so I didn't want our kids to have that same kind of experience.
Exactly. So are you writing frequently, or in when you feel like it?
When I feel like it.
Okay,
that's right,
that gives the rest of us permission, because that's when I write, is when I feel like it, when it's not going to be work. Thank you, Jack. I'm looking forward to hearing you read.
Shall I begin? All right. Yeah. I spent my childhood in a small town in eastern Indiana named Carthage. It was founded by Quakers in 1834, and it was not named for that ancient city-state that rivaled Rome, but after a small town in North Carolina, from which Quaker farmers moved in 1834 due to an increasing number of slaveholding plantations locating in that area. But that's another story. 100 years later, the year that I was born, Carthage, Indiana had a population of exactly 1,000. In fact, it always had a population of exactly 1,000. Or at least it did over the almost 2 decades that I lived there. It seemed like every time somebody died, somebody had a baby. I guess that's called a sustainable population. I remembered Carthage as a commercial hub, so to speak, of a broad farming district in the valley of the Big Blue River, which, in fact, was neither big nor blue. I was delivered at home by Doc McNabb and spent the next 14 years of my life with my parents and my brother Jim in our house in the Rose Hill edition of Carthage. Growing up in Carthage was a kaleidoscope of Norman Rockwell paintings. Barefoot in the summer, I fished and rafted on the Big Blue River, dove off of the Big 4 railway bridge in between trains, bought candy at Skinny Winfield's grocery store, got haircuts from my Uncle Mike Kaiser, who always gave me a sucker. I watched mechanics fix cars at Herbie Beher's garage and chose up sides for a game at the high school softball field. And occasionally sipped malted milks at Ed Blythe's drugstore with Marlene Graff. In May, school would be winding down, and summer vacations in this farming community would be anticipated with mixed emotions. Children of farm families could expect a summer of demanding physical labor, then return to school in the fall with toned torsos and unique tans from mid-forehead to lower neck and on the arms from mid-biceps down, peculiar to all genders who worked long hours in the sun under caps and rolled-up sleeves. Those of us who lived in town mowed lawns, worked at grocery stores, the drugstore, the hardware store, the ice cream parlor, or, if we were really lucky, we got a job at De Schipper's canning factory. The De Schippers were supposedly descended from a Dutch immigrant family, but no one seemed to know just how they managed to wind up in this little farming community in eastern Indiana. At least, no one in my family knew. Maybe it's because it reminds them of Holland, being so flat and everything, my Aunt Ethel used to say. If that were the case, then why didn't they go to Kansas, my Aunt Goldie would reply sarcastically, impatient with what she regarded as her younger sister's simplicity. Not enough water, Goldie, you know that. The Dutch, they like canals and lakes, replied Aunt Ethel with tolerant disdain, oblivious to the fact that the only water to be seen around Carthage was 6 Mile Creek and the meandering and slightly polluted Blue River. In any event, the De Schippers were clearly the biggest employer of students who spent their summer unloading hampers of tomatoes, then dumping them on conveyor belts, where they would be carried through scalding water to tables of Carthaginian women who would peel them in preparation for canning. Unloading the tomatoes from farmers' trucks and wagons had several side benefits, like all the field-ripened tomatoes you could eat, seasoned by one of those salt tablets they put in every can. The riotous joy of an occasional all-out tomato fight when the foreman was not about, and the opportunity to earn a modest wage, the beginning initiation into adulthood, while enjoying the camaraderie of good friends. But World War II was to have a profound effect upon the culture and experiences at De Schipper's canning factory, with unexpected outcomes for the De Schippers as well as the town of Carthage. With the advent of war, many of Carthage's finest young men either volunteered or were drafted into the service. Their families proudly displayed the bright blue star in the window, signifying a member of the family was serving. And as the war went on, sometimes a gold star would appear if a family member had been killed in action. A few families were given exemptions for their sons to assure that the farm would continue to be productive during wartime, as farm products were desperately needed for the war effort. But still, labor became increasingly scarce, and when it came to meeting the demands of the Harvest De Schipper canning factory especially. By the mid-1940s, with increasing victories in North Africa and Europe, the government was to provide an unexpected solution to this manpower shortage. One day a train arrived on the Big 4 railway, and from its cars emerged what seemed like a large number of German prisoners of war, accompanied by a group of U.S. soldiers. Up to this time, the war had been strangely distant, almost like an event one read about in Mr. Baker's history class. except that it was going on now, albeit in some far-off places, the names of which one couldn't pronounce. We watched with fascination the newsreels that preceded the double feature Hopalong Cassidy westerns and John Garfield gangster films every Saturday night at the community center. Or we caught snatches of news reports over the radio. Or we read dispatches in the Indianapolis News, usually accompanied by maps with arrows going in various directions. We occasionally heard from neighbors that one of their sons was on leave or had been assigned to a unit going overseas, and as the war dragged on, that someone was killed in action or missing. I was 10 years old and trying to fathom what the war was all about. I gathered from the news that the fighting the war was an honorable thing, that the Germans were Nazis. I wasn't sure what that meant, but clearly it was bad. And fighting Nazis and defeating their army was the whole purpose of the war. Very quickly, the war became the focus of our play, and my friends and I built howitzers out of rug tubes and the front wheels of our broken wagons, bazookas from pieces of pipe, and bayonets from old wooden slats. We drilled and marched and fought battles with imaginary Nazis, back and forth across McManus's gravel pit, through Sally Newby's woods, and occasionally around the Ripley Township School building when we needed to do house-to-house fighting. And then the train came. The German soldiers who got off that train looked strangely like the fellows I knew from Carthage who had gotten on those same trains to leave a few years before. But these were the enemy. I didn't know what a Nazi was, but somehow these people didn't look like what I thought an enemy should look like. They looked less frightening than they looked frightened, and I began to wonder what it would be like being an American soldier getting off a train like that in Germany. The prisoners were housed in temporary barracks, always under guard. Every day they would go to the fields to pick tomatoes or work on the unloading docks, dumping tomatoes into the washer bins, and although continuously under guard, contacts between prisoners and town workers at the canning factory became inevitable, indeed necessary for the efficient running of the factory. Interactions began to ease somewhat, and we gradually became accustomed to their presence. Eventually, the prisoners were allowed to attend a few movies at the community center, of course, always sitting off to the side with their omnipresent armed escorts. I wondered how they must have felt watching the newsreels just before the main feature describing some important battle in which the German army had been defeated. In the interactions about the canning factory, gradually there was an inevitable increasing familiarity. Enmity and war became complicated concepts, especially for 10-year-olds, trying to understand the complexities of an adult world. I recall later being told that one of the prisoners who spoke English and had experience running his family's business in Germany had been assigned to help in the canning factory office. A handsome and intelligent young man, no one seems to have noticed at the time that something in the exchanges between this young man and Mr. de Schipper's attractive daughter began to transcend issues like accounts receivable, bills of lading, canning tomatoes, or even a world war. Eventually, the war ended, and the German prisoners boarded their train and headed east for their return to homes and families. President Roosevelt had died, a significant event, not only because he was the president, in fact, the only president I had ever known at that point, but also because my father teared up over his death, a startling observation since my father was an ex-Marine, never cried, and was a Republican. But his Irish Catholic working class roots obviously influenced him. He was a supporter of Wendell Willkie, a progressive Republican who came from Rush County and whom my father and I had visited on his farm, not far from where we lived. Then my father announced he thought Harry Truman was a decent person, even though he, like Roosevelt, was a Democrat. I suspect this was primarily because Truman was from Missouri, my father's home state. I don't know if he voted for Truman after that, but obviously my father's sense of political ideology appeared at times to transcend the distinction between Democrats and Republicans. We celebrated victory first in Europe and then in the Pacific. But the celebration became muted as we saw the first pictures in newsreels taken of concentration camps. I recall the uncomprehending distress I experienced as I watched these films with my father. And we both said nothing as we left the theater, and I walked to the car in silence. I was stunned, baffled, frightened beyond anything I had ever experienced at the horror I had seen. And I had nightmares about concentration camps for years after. I could not get my 11-year-old mind around that question, nor could my father, he admitted, comprehend, yet alone explain to me what drove people to commit such inhuman acts. Did the prisoners at the canning factory do those kinds of things? I asked my father. He didn't know, since they'd been captured in Italy and North Africa, whereas the concentration camps we saw in the films were mostly in Eastern Europe. But in retrospect, I wondered, had I wanted to believe that our prisoners were not involved in the running of those camps? Gradually, local boys returned from the war, and the names of those who didn't were placed on the county war memorial. Soon memories of the war began to fade as Carthage and Rush County began to readapt to local and national issues and problems. And then one day, according to one account, I heard a young man stepped off the train to be met by Mr. de Schipper's daughter, now a beautiful and mature young woman. I was told it was the young German soldier who had worked in the office at the canning factory, and not long after, they supposedly married. I don't recall where I heard that story or if it was even true, nor do I recall that I ever heard what happened to them. I'd like to believe that they lived happily ever after, raising a family and running de Schipper's canning factory. But in fact, the canning factory soon went out of business, unable to compete with the rapidly developing fruit and vegetable production of California. Perhaps they moved to California, or perhaps he took her back to Germany where they would run his family's business. Nobody seems to know where they went, which seems symbolic of a transition in time that was taking place for Carthage. The war had a profound effect upon our town. Boys and girls who went off to war, many did not return. For those who did return, came back as men and women, some scarred and maimed in spirit as well as body. Many people left to take defense jobs elsewhere, to be with loved ones, to go to school, or pursue new opportunities in other states. Some never returned. It was to be an increasing phenomenon with each succeeding generation, and I, like most of my generation, left never to go back. The war marked the end of an age of innocence for this small rural farming community. Suddenly, a more complex world was closing in, the Cold War threatening, other people's problems more omnipresent. Before the war, we had been secure and confident in our insularity. Now the Carthaginians were less secure and far less significant in the world that had been thrust upon them.
Oh, boy.
Thank you, Jack. You have taken us on a trip in the past, and that phrase, the age of innocence, just pictured what you talked about. Thank you so much,
Happy to
Jack.
share it with you.
It was just great. Thank you. Come back again. Go home and write something else.
Okay. What about the Carthaginians?
Audrey, welcome again.
Thank
We
you.
love having you come back. We have loved your sharing of yours and Bill's wonderful travels, and I look forward to today. But before we get started, I'd love you to share a title or an author who has kind of changed the way you look at the world, who has kind of affected your outlook. Have you given that thought since I froze
Yes.
that?
Yes. I like travel writing, and I've done a lot of it. But I found a book in our library here. It's called Border Crossings, A Journey on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And it is spectacular. It is colorful. It uses different fonts. It has little watercolor sketches in it.
Yeah.
And it shows me that I don't have to be quite so stiff and businesslike when I write. It kind of overdoes it, but I recommend everybody looking at that book. It's by a woman named Emma Fick, F-I-C-K, and it's in our library.
And the title one more time is
Border Crossings,
Crossings.
A Journey on the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
Oh, thank you for sharing that title
You're
and that author. So now we go, and Audrey, for the first time, has some slides. So look forward to those. So you may get started now.
And
Okay.
There are not many. I have only 4. This book, which looks like this, is one of about 20 travel accounts that I've written and I loan out. If you are interested in some country, check and see if I have one. This one was written, now our last books that I've done have been done with an online publisher. And they look quite professional, not like the Kinko printed papers there. What I'm going to read is from an account that I wrote 42 years ago. In Japan, it was 1982. Bill and I were only 46 years old. And 42 years ago, Japan was quite different. And I think you'll pick some of that stuff up. For instance, I talk of their heavy single-speed bikes. Our bike, a 10-speed, was, really different. People still went to public bathhouses, walking down the street with a plastic basin with hairbrush and towel in it. And you'll be amazed at how much we spent for meals and accommodations. We were different. We didn't take naps. We had lots of energy. And we were amazingly gutsy in what we did. So I'm going to start reading. Our adventure is called a Japanese adventure, and it was the first time we went to Japan. It was a 1-month trip in July of 1982 in the islands of Honshu and Kyushu. We rode our bicycles for half of the trip and on trains and buses during the rest. We were both 47 years old at the time and had previously bicycled in bicycle toured in European countries. And you can see on the map, the red line was when we were on the bus or train, and the green line is the bicycle touring. As you can see, we start in Kyoto, we go out to the coast, bike along the Japan Sea coast, and then I stop this writing at that point, but we continued on into Kyushu. Because we knew we'd be traveling alone, not on a tour, we started preparing for the trip the fall before by taking Japanese language classes, and we did a lot of reading about Japan. The language classes paid off because as people spoke slowly and clearly to us, even we could take care of our simple needs, even if no one spoke English. People were curious about us, and we could say where we were from, where we were going, and we could tell them we thought their country was beautiful and the activity we were watching was interesting. Unfortunately, beautiful and interesting were the only two Japanese adjectives we could consistently remember, so our conversations were not long. We traveled rather lightly. We took our own bikes, old 10-speed Japanese bikes, inexpensive enough that when we left them, we could just chain them together and not worry. We knew that if they were stolen, we could replace them for about $200 each. On the flight over, and whenever we rode in a train or bus, we carried the bikes partially disassembled in commercially made bike bags. And there you can see a picture. This is on a different, this is on a trip to Burgundy, I think. But you can see the blue bags. And you can see the panniers on the floor. From the plane trip, we just tied them together. And the bike was one piece of luggage. The panniers were the second. And I can't remember if we had a third. We carried our handlebar bags with us as, like purses. And we didn't ever get them separated from us. Each bag had a heavy shoulder strap for carrying. The bikes in their bags were awkward and heavy, but we could switch from riding to carrying the bikes onto a train or a bus in about 30 minutes. So that's worth a lot to have that flexibility. On planes, a bike in its bag counted as one piece of luggage. And on this trip, we didn't have to pay extra for them. The two panniers tied together were our second piece. We kept the handlebars. Our wardrobe for the month consisted of 3 complete outfits, all washable while we showered and dryable overnight. We got pretty efficient, Because my bike had a mixie frame, I wore either a skirt or culottes while riding. We also carried rain jackets, bathing suits, and shorts, and when we arrived in Kyoto, we bought yukatas, which are cotton kimonos that Japanese people wore as robes, and even outside as they walked to their neighborhood public bath in late afternoon. I think, okay, this is a different trip because I'm wearing long pants, but remember that I was always in a skirt Unbelievable. Or culottes. Our rain jackets were too heavy, and they were like we were in a sauna. While the Japanese cyclists held an umbrella over their hand while they pedaled on their heavy single-speed bikes. Our bikes were too unstable with their heavy loads to steer using only one hand. So no umbrellas. After traveling, and that's all the pictures I tucked in. After traveling from Tokyo to Kyoto by train, we checked into Myokenji, a Buddhist temple, for a few days. It was by far the most beautiful and exotic place we stayed on the trip. I had seen this temple mentioned in a list of minshuku, which are bed and breakfasts, distributed by the Japanese Tourist Office. During the U.S. occupation of Japan after World War II, the American government instituted land reform in Japan, in which most Buddhist temples lost their rice fields, so they had to find some way to pay for their upkeep. Some had preschools or daycare centers, but Myokenji took in paying guests. For the equivalent of $14 per person per day, it provided a beautiful traditional room and a large traditional breakfast. The temple is located in the northern section of Kyoto, a 20-minute bus ride from the train station. Surrounded on all sides by houses and small shops, it's a compound of about 6 buildings enclosed by a wall and covers perhaps a half of a city block. After slipping out of our shoes and donning plastic scuffs, we entered the 2-story entrance hall, where a young Buddhist nun, probably in her 20s, sat at a desk and seemed to run the hotel management affairs of the temple. Her head was completely shaved, and she wore a loose-fitting khaki cotton shirt and pants. She was pleasant, but rather non-communicative. She acknowledged our reservation, one of only 4 we made for the whole month, and led us down an outdoor walkway that wound through stands of bamboo to the entrance of our room. We took off our scuffs and entered through sliding shoji screens. She showed us the features of the room. And before she left us, she gave us an English translation of the rules for guests in the temple. Baths could be taken in the men's and women's baths between 4:30 and 10 p.m. Breakfast was between 7:30 and 8:30 in the morning, and guests were invited to attend the worship service in the main temple at 5:30 in the morning. The room was about 9 feet by 12 feet, and the floor was completely covered with tatami mats. The only furniture was a low table flanked by flat, square pillows called zabuton, a small wooden screen upon which to hang damp towels, an electric fan, and an electric incense burner, which was used to discourage mosquitoes. We would sit on the zabuton on the floor and write postcards and studied maps at the low table. There were no chairs. The wall opposite the door had big windows covered by sliding, whoops. Okay, I've missed something here. The wall opposite the door had big windows covered by shoji. The wide roof overhang kept most of the rain from entering the open windows, but when we had heavy rain, we closed the big windows and opened a smaller one near the ceiling. The third wall had a sliding panel that hid 2 futons and lightweight quilts, which we spread on the tatami at night and stored in the cabinet during the day. The fourth wall of the room contained the tokonoma, an alcove with a scroll painting and a flower arrangement. Some of the cheaper minshuku we were to stay in later had a coin-operated TV in this place of honor. After a hot bath that evening, Bill and I, wearing our yukatas, sat on the edge of one of the walkways, enjoying the serene atmosphere and trying to adjust to the amazing fact that we actually were in a Buddhist temple in Japan. We awoke a little after 5 in the morning. There was no city noise, and we could hear the gentle cooing of doves under the eaves. A mellow temple bell sounded several times as we dressed, and we heard the rhythmic clacking of wooden blocks being struck. Slipping into our scuffs at the door, we quickly walked through the maze of walkways and crossed an open courtyard. On the far side was the huge dark wooden temple, topped by an immense flaring gray tile roof. On the veranda near the door were 3 pairs of slippers. We added our slippers to the line and slid the door open. We had no idea what to expect. Inside was a huge tatami floored room, completely empty except for a large ornate altar and a few small low desk-like tables, behind which knelt the nun and 2 priests. We quietly sat down at the edge of the room from where we could see both the altar and the action. There were no other worshipers. In fact, we discovered that there was only one other paying guest in the whole temple while we were there. The nun was wearing a voluminous purple robe. With her shaved head, she looked completely exotic, and only her Timex watch on her wrist reminded us of the businesslike manner of the day before. Kneeling with head bowed and a book in hand, she was chanting in a reedy monotone, in a strange discordant harmony with the 2 priests. The older priest, wearing gold-rimmed glasses, had a gravelly voice. For the next 40 minutes, they chanted, struck gongs, clacked wooden sticks or blocks, clapped hands, sat up straight, bowed so low their foreheads touched the floor, and beat on drums. The nun at one point beat a wild drum roll that looked like so much fun to perform that I decided it must have been the perk that made her choose her religious life. After the service, we wandered around the temple compound until breakfast was served at 7:30. Breakfast was the hardest meal to get used to in Japan. It had small dishes of pickled vegetables, a bowl of miso soup, as much rice as we liked, and a big thermos of hot water for refilling the pot of green tea. Because Bill had never learned to cook, and still doesn't, he had the hardest time preparing and eating the bowl of hot rice into which he had to crack a raw egg. The trick was to immediately stir the rice and egg so that the egg would congeal from the heat of the rice. He'd stare at the raw egg so long that the rice would become too cool to cook the egg, and soy sauce only partially disguised it. Once we were traveling on our bikes, we preferred to leave our overnight accommodation without eating a traditional breakfast. Then we'd stop after an hour's riding in a kohi house soup. Now remember, this is many years before Starbucks, for morning a service soup. I should say that they always had to put a vowel after the consonants when they were using foreign words. So that's why it's morning a service soup. The breakfast consisted of coffee, either hot or iced, an inch-thick slice of buttered toast, a hard-boiled egg, and a salad, most often coleslaw or potato salad served on a lettuce leaf. This breakfast cost $1.25 and was popular with office workers on their way to work. If we weren't picnicking, we'd often stop at a kohi house soup for a light lunch. We also often stopped in the heat of the afternoon for a cooling chocolate parfait. Parfait. It consisted of a couple of scoops of ice cream, chocolate sauce, one slice each of cantaloupe, grapefruit, and apple, and would be crowned with whipped cream topped by a dried prune. Dinner, often served in our minshuku, the bed and breakfast, usually included several kinds of fish or shellfish, several kinds of pickled vegetables, and always rice. Green tea and beer, pronounced biru, were the usual drinks served with dinner, although a few times we had warm sake. Once we left Kyoto, we had to find accommodations every day, and it was surprisingly easy. When we felt we'd ridden far enough for the day, or arrived at a town that was especially attractive, we'd find the train station, or if there wasn't a train station, the bus depot. There we'd ask the ticket seller if there was a minshuku or inexpensive ryokan in the area. The clerk would always have a printed list of possibilities, and he'd consult with the other employees before recommending one. It was always done with the warning that it wouldn't be Western, that we'd be sleeping on a futon and using chopsticks. Then the clerk would call the place to make sure they had a vacancy and to warn the proprietor that we were foreigners. It was always close to the station, and we'd follow a hand-drawn map to find it. Some were family homes with small children whose yellow duckies lined the edge of the bathtub. Others were so elegant they should have been called ryokan, not minshuku. When we arrived, we would discuss with the owner about whether we wanted dinner or breakfast. And occasionally, we stayed in government-owned tourist hotels, always set in spectacular scenery, but not nearly as friendly as the minshuku. From Kyoto, we rode northwest along the north shore of Lake Biwa. The road was clogged with bumper-to-bumper traffic, with local families heading for lakeside beaches. But luckily, there was a parallel sidewalk used by bicyclists. So we traveled both fast and safe. Later that afternoon, we crossed a mountain pass, low by U.S. standards, and had a steep descent with hairpin curves ahead of us. It had begun to rain, and we dreaded the constant braking on wet pavement with truck traffic squeezing by. Then we noticed that although we were miles from any town, a sidewalk began at the pass, and we could descend quite safely without worrying about traffic. The ride south along the coast was beautiful, but a little grueling. We'd climb to the top of every headland in a sweat-producing series of hairpin curves. Enjoy about 10 minutes of gloriously cool coasting back down to the sea level, with the next headland already in sight across the valley. Our adventure continued as we rode in Kyushu, the next island, but that's a subject for another writer's read.
Oh, Audrey, we need to have both you and Jack come back. That was a big afternoon treat for all of us. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
It was just, I was right with you. I just,
Sweating, I hope.
oh, land, that was wonderful. And next month, I think, is Linda here? It's April 12th. And Bernice Kastner and Don Meyer are going to read. So think about you reading. Go home and write something and give Linda Niebank a call. Linda has her hand up. We do have a little bit of time. Let's do that. Might there be questions for either Audrey or Jack? Both of those were such rich. Do you have your hand?
Well, I just have a comment.
Comment. We like comments, Jane.
Oh, my goodness. I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed both of you, having experienced much of what you're talking about. I will say this about the Japanese breakfast. Yours were a lot better than ours. But anyway, that's a, and then to Jack and his Indiana background, where my family pioneered the territory of Indiana. We'll talk about that later. But we did not have German, I don't remember German prisoners, but we had a lot of Italians here. And thankfully, they were allowed to work, and they started the best collection of Italian restaurants. That we have Seattle have them to thank for our Italian restaurants. Some of them went home and came back and started the restaurants here. You know, they never forgot their beginnings here. So, but having experienced the same years and the same, yeah. I'm older than you are, however.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Any other comments or questions here? What a good afternoon. And we were right with them, 150%. Every word, every word. Thank you so much, both of you. And see you in April. Come back and go home and write.